This apples to apples comparison often leads us to some erroneous confidence in our conclusions about how the US and China stack up. The appropriate comparisons are something more like apples to oranges, but it's sufficient to say, looking at these capabilities stacked up, that these are the two most capable militaries in the world in almost any respect, and that a conflict between them would be catastrophic for everyone.
Does the US or China have a larger military?
You're not talking about the whole force against the whole force. What we're talking about in respect of China is almost exclusively contingencies in the Western Pacific and along China's littoral. And so there you're talking about more or less all of the Chinese forces versus whatever part of the US forces would be engaged there. So just with that caveat as a starting point, on paper, China's armed forces are larger than America's according to certain ways of counting it, and smaller according to others. The U.S. defense budget, you may, and your listeners may well know, is substantially larger than China's reported defense budget. About $840 billion, I think, is the National Defense Authorization bill that's just passed Congress in the U.S. And I think the latest estimate on the Chinese official defense budget was $230 billion. So that's quite a substantial gap, but it's a question of what you get for that and also what's included in the overall figure. For better and for worse, NDAA details all of the specific line items for which this $840 billion is allocated. We know just sort of the top lines on the Chinese side, and we also know that they spend more overall on domestic security forces and also have quite an integrated industrial sector supporting defense procurement and programs, and that ought to factor in. So US is bigger there. China's bigger in terms of manpower, 2 million active personnel compared to the US, I think at 1.35 is the latest estimate. But again, these quantitative assessments are not necessarily indicative of what the real balance of military power is. Most of those are just standing infantry forces. The quality of those forces varies quite significantly. U.S. Combat forces, of course, have exercised that capability repeatedly and continuously over the course of the last 20 some odd years and longer, frankly, whereas the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, should have noted, has had very, very limited combat experience and has overall probably a lower quality of training and caliber of troop from a kind of an objective skills and tactical capability standpoint. Other capabilities that you might reasonably measure in trying to assess the relative military capabilities of the US and China are their fleet, the Navy, and in particular, what you'd think of as the battle force ships, the ones that are part of any combat operation for a Navy. The US here holds what I would describe as a qualitative edge now. The PLA Navy, their overall battle force is now over 370 ships, 140 major surface combatants, whereas the United States is now around 290 and aiming for 355, but not having much of a pathway towards reaching that given our capacity and shipbuilding and resources. So the PLA Navy is larger from a number of ships standpoint, but from a gross tonnage standpoint, the US remains significantly larger. From a quality or qualitative standpoint, the capability of the ships, the US maintains a significant edge. US operates 11 carriers, all of which are nuclear powered. These things draft something on the order of 100,000 tons compared to much smaller non-nuclear powered, much less capable carriers, two now deployed for China. And that's just one particular metric. Submarines is an even more significant example of a major qualitative and quantitative edge for the United States. So, the fact of the PLA Navy being larger ship for ship is misleading. I think most naval experts would assess US naval capability to be significantly better, but China has come on very, very fast and closed the gap in many significant ways. US fields more aircraft, and in particular, more advanced aircraft, about 14,000 total for the US versus only 2,800 in China. And the US force is much more high quality composition, many more fourth gen and higher fighters compared to China's modernizing and improving, but still inferior air forces. The key thing to point out here is that the role of air forces in a distant theater in which the United States would meet China requires air basing and requires all sorts of things that allow that air power to project forward, to include carriers. And so there's an asymmetry in terms of the things that each country needs to do with this air power. Final two things to note are nuclear weapons. United States has a large quantitative and qualitative edge here in most respects, about 3,700 warheads in the United States versus an estimated 500 in China. Even though the Chinese figure has increased dramatically over time and is trending towards 1,000, that's still not an area where they're coming towards parity. One area in which China is arguably superior, and it's hard to get exact counts on these, but you can say in qualitative terms, is in missile forces. The PLA has, in fact, its own rocket force, a service of the PLA that controls their ballistic missile forces, which are both nuclear and conventional capable. And this is an area where the U.S., over the course of a lot of arms control, as well as fighting a lot of combat missions that didn't require intermediate and medium range ballistic missiles, basically disinvested from this element of our force, whereas the PLA has looked at this as an area of major asymmetric advantage, a way to deny U.S. access to this East Asian theater. And so the PLA has quantitative and qualitative advantages in a lot of different types of missile forces, particularly those kind of theater range, intermediate and medium range and short range ballistic missiles, as well as some of the technological advancements in the field, like hypersonics, for example, where China has actually made some really significant progress and arguably fields superior capabilities to the U.S. So all of this is a long way of saying is the U.S. as a military force on paper looks superior in most respects. However, as I said up front, what we're generally talking about when we think about U.S. and China military competition are contingencies that are concentrated in East Asia. And so we're looking at a very different way of those forces engaging with one another, and to really get a sense of, how would such and such conflicts play out, you really need to dial in some of those specifics with the presumption that they'll have the same set of strategic objectives and same set of strategic interests as does the United States.
Is the Chinese military currently an active threat to American-held territories?
Another challenging question. I'll give you the short answer, which is yes, but to U.S. territories in the Pacific primarily, like Guam and Hawaii. The longer answer is no, not really. It's a threat to that particular set of military facilities that are within the range of engaging in a fight in the Western Pacific. That's the best that I think we can say about the type of capabilities that we've been talking about over the course of this conversation, is that they are concentrated on this hypothetical fight in the Western Pacific. This apples to apples comparison often leads us to some erroneous confidence in our conclusions about how the U.S. and China stack up. The appropriate comparisons are something more like apples to oranges. When we look at the U.S. Navy and its capabilities in the Western Pacific, or the U.S. Joint Force, what we should array it against is what is sometimes called China's anti-Navy, this suite of anti-access area denial capabilities, most prominently highlighted by the missile forces, but also submarines and a range of other ways in which China would look at this as an area where it must put U.S. military forces, which include forces based on U.S. territories, as well as the territories of allies, must put them at risk. And that's what we've seen coming into really full focus over these last few years. And it is primarily, if not exclusively, concentrated in that Western Pacific region. And so I think we really need to think more carefully as we make these types of assessments. I don't think you should trust anybody who offers a blithe assertion about here's how this or that conflict would play out. There are far too many uncertainties about the pathway to conflict and the nature of the interactions between great powers like the United States and China. But it's sufficient to say, looking at these capabilities stacked up, that these are the two most capable militaries in the world in almost any respect, and that a conflict between them would be catastrophic for everyone.